Now, when the visitor comes there, but the visitor is not only, some of them come with the specific idea of looking at the things. Then there are special visitors who want to go to the innards of the museum, go to see specific objects like coins. It's always not very visually, present, so you cannot show them. Then comes, and the museum will have to have special arrangement for those special visitors like scholars, academicians, and people who have come for a specific purpose. Then there are objects, besides that, the objects will have to be, the ones that are stored is okay, but then they will have to be stored properly. They will have to be conserved properly. There will be huge laboratories and, laboratories meant for different types of objects, material objects, wood, stone, glass, etc. Objects like textiles, they need special attention, special care, specific, knowledge, and also like miniature paintings as well as big canvases. So according to the type of object, you will have to decide that. Different type of storage, different type of conservation and presentation. Now, how are you going to run the whole thing? You will have to have a viable administration. And the administration and the management is also done by, a board. Sometimes the government directly, they don't interfere. There is a proper machinery, there is an advisory body or a board of trustees, because the trustees become responsible for the upkeep of the museum, for collecting the funds and also looking after the other things. Now coming back to the visitors also need to have objects like, say for mementos. They want to have photographs, publications, portfolios, pictures. So there will, and also there will have to be gift shops and stores. Now these gift shops, mind you, they add to the revenue of the museum, because a part of that gift shop, the pricing is kept in such a way that they are an additional source of revenue. So the gift shops are important, and the gifts, they should be made with a lot of ideas. The gift should be sufficiently attractive, and the prices also should be made in that way so that they are neither too costly nor too cheap. Then coming back, then museum will have to have a series of programs to make the place more accessible and attractive. The museum will also, have to attract a type of people who would think that the museum is their pride. They would be associated, they are friends of the museum, they are patrons of the museum. They will give their collection, their own collection to the museum, because they would think that this museum is the proper place where people could come and enjoy. And then there is another type of people who provide proper funds to the museum. And unless the funding is there and constantly, then it would be difficult to run a big museum like that. Then the museum will have to have a garden, a different section for the children, because they need special place. Then there will also have to be big auditorium, lecture theatres, where there will be special lectures with invited scholars and academicians. Then there will have to be concerts, like musical soiree. Then there will have to be dance and other programs. So constantly there will have to have some kind of activity that would be, proper, or that would be appropriate for the visitors. Not only the visitors who are coming, but also the people who are resident to that place. The museum's work is to involve them in as many ways as possible, so that they become a part and parcel of the museum concepts and museum idea. One thing that irritates me is a ban on photography. A ban on photography. Why? Why should you stop people to take, some uh, moments when they spent it as a memento, as an important thing? I mean, say for example, he is visiting this place only once in his life. If I go to Hampi or Vijayanagara or a place like Somnath or Dholadira, why should I not be allowed to take a snap, a photograph as a memento? I'm not going to publish it or make use of it. For that, you need to have, uh, proper digital photographs.
So in my role here as part of this larger project, I hope I can provide a little information about how museums function and I guess more so in the North American context. I'm sure for those visiting our galleries, it's always a bit of a mystery how things come into the collection and how we decide what to display. So, in the case of most of the museums I've worked in, these are sort of privately operating entities, but they do operate in the public interest. So the exception to this and the way that collections were built up would be the example in Doha, where the collections were put together by a royal family and then transferred to a government trust, where they are now as part of a museum authority. But the collections here in North America were all established, either late 19th or early 20th century, and were built up primarily by private collectors who gave their collections to the museum, and then in more recent years by the museum being able to make purchases. So this is a bit different from sort of the old centuries-long collections belonging to royal families, say in Europe, that have now become public museums. The Aga Khan Museum is yet another iteration, starting off, yes, as a private family collection, but now part of a public trust and operating as a charitable organization, but also formed within the last decades, so fairly recent. And so this means most of the collections are things that are bought on the art market. And so, come to the attention of the collectors through dealers or auction houses and represent their personal interests. So in that way, there might be rather idiosyncratic gaps, or let's say even concentrations within the collections based on that particular person's interests. Where the curators come in when we're buying now for the collections is to sort of round out these things that reflect these very personal interests. So we think more broadly, okay, in the period that I'm interested to cover, these are the major landmarks in the history of art, and I want to be able to represent them all in the galleries and to our public. So then you purchase very judiciously examples that would help make you be able to present a moment in time to the public. Now, how we go about buying these objects today is a bit different than in the past. We all now follow a set of rules established in 1970 by UNESCO that attempts to limit the movement illegally of works of art out of their country of origin. So everything that we would potentially buy for the museum must have been outside of its country of origin and sort of on the art market before 1970. Other than that, objects we now feel, as a worldwide community, should stay in the places that they were made. And even with that 1970 mark, though, we want to make sure we understand from to whom the object passed, try and piece together as much of that history year by year as possible to make sure that something wasn't stolen, looted, taken under duress during difficult political circumstances, that kind of thing. And in this way, we try to authenticate our objects and to do the research before something ever enters in our collections. Then once it's in the collection, we as curators do have the honor of trying to figure out how to present these objects to a public. And this involves certainly our own background information and research into the objects, but probably more than we'd like to admit, interference, shall we say, or collaboration with colleagues and sort of input from education departments, from administration. We have donors to think of that might be behind the reason why we highlight certain objects for periods of time. But really, we're trying to think of stories we can tell the public. We understand certain objects might not be totally or immediately understandable to people who haven't been immersed in this world of art history for a long time. So we like to think of ways to frame the objects that you allow you as the public to come in, dip into a gallery, and still be able to pick up something about an object's history, its significance, why we curators have gotten so excited about it. And that idea of storytelling, I think, is coming more and more into how museum displays are designed. Whereas before you might have thought, you might have seen things displayed in galleries, so chronologically, geographically, and the main story being the passage of time. Now you might find more thematic groupings throughout the galleries within this superstructure of chronology and geography. And we're trying to think of, how people can relate these objects that might be centuries old to their present day lives to make things relevant is the buzzword. And I think this approach definitely has its merits and definitely pushes us as curators to keep thinking how we want to interpret things for the public. And just because it's old and we say that it's important doesn't immediately make it compelling to people, that they need to have a little bit of a story behind something to understand why it's been decided to enter in a museum collection, why it's decided to go onto view, which leads to the next question. For sure, every museum has a large percentage of its collections that are in the storeroom. So museums might only display at the most maybe 10 to 15% of their entire holdings. Or if you think of museums like the Louvre or the British Museum, that percentage goes down to 2%, 1%, because they have millions of objects literally in their collections. And that's where sort of a qualitative judgment comes in. Things might be important as records of the place and time that they were made, but they don't necessarily look good in a display case in a gallery. They have to be sort of legible, so to speak, to a public and be able to sort of stand out, have a presence in the galleries. And so we don't discard, naturally, the items that we might not choose to show in the galleries. They're there for our study and for members of the public to come see if they want to make appointments. And we now have the option of putting our collections online so everyone is aware of all the things we have, even if they aren't on view, which I think is a fantastic move forward. But really, when you're making that selection of what goes on view, I suppose it is a subjective judgment that you're making on the objects, but really this idea of its presence, its ability to tell a story, as I was mentioning before, to provide a variety in materials that we've got on display. So don't say just have room after room of paintings, but have sculpture, woodwork, glass, and so on. And it's got to also be in good condition. And so a lot of our decisions as well go into the nature of the object and how long it can stay on view. We are constantly worried about things like humidity and temperature, as well as light control within the galleries, to make sure that the other main part of our job, that we preserve these works of art for future generations, is upheld. So when putting together a display, you might want to touch on subjects that's dealt with in paintings, but you have to make sure that if these paintings are on paper, which the collections I deal with usually are, that you have several backups with that same subject matter so that you can keep changing them out of the gallery. So it becomes a bit of a puzzle between the objects you have in your collection, the points that you want to make, the condition of those objects, and the various display constraints that come together then to make a gallery or an exhibition display. So I hope that doesn't take the magic out of what goes on behind the scenes at the museum, but in the end, a lot of practical factors come into play. So if I've been speaking a lot about how museums have operated for the past few centuries, I think we're in a really interesting moment right now with this COVID shutdown that's caused us to rethink how museums operate in general. And I'm excited for what happens when the world reopens again after this moment. I think museums have been justly criticized as being elitist, difficult for people to approach, not only from a social point of view, but now we're trying to think about what makes those barriers to entrance from a physical or mental or many other points of view. And I think we're also rethinking how we display objects. It's not just a matter of putting something out on the wall or in a showcase with a label, but really rethinking how that information is presented. Is it understandable to a public, or are we just speaking to ourselves as curators? And how can we use digital media more effectively to reach audiences? And so I'm not sure I have answers yet, but I do have a lot of hope for the future of museums, and I'm interested to see where they go in their next iteration.
I like about museums which are communicating, which are engaging, which are interactive, and which offer you a space to question. So, and the museums which are passive and do not communicate well with visitors are no more attractive. And I'm sure that's true with others as well.
This is a difficult question. I like objects that are old. I like objects that belong to the past. So I love to go into museums and, just spend time looking at these old objects and wondering about them. But I think what I don't like about museums, especially the museums that we see, that we are used to in India, is that very few of them tell us the stories of the objects. And I think, there's also the sense that, we shouldn't touch the object, we shouldn't go too close to it. And I feel somewhere, even though that has changed in other countries, it hasn't yet changed in our country. And the stability of the object, being able to see it, feel it, to understand its craft, to understand, what is it that went on when, it was made. And maybe, the museum also gives us a story of that past. I would have liked that a lot.
I have one favorite exhibit of mine displayed in the Science and Technology Heritage of India in Science City, Kolkata. That exhibit is Gharat, called the Watermill. It depicts the 500-year-old technology developed indigenously by the poor people of those Himalayan hills. It uses water power through a gradient, turns the turbine, and subsequently a stone wheel, which grinds grains for those villagers. And that is technology developed much earlier than motive power was in vogue, or people knew about electric power or other form of powers.
Yes, indeed, I do. And I think, I was wondering which one to talk about here, but I think I'll talk about one that is my favorite. My favorite object is this head. It is the head of Nihu Angami, who was a Naga leader, and it was made by Margaret Millward, who was an artist who had come to Shantiniketan and worked in Tagore's Vishwabharati, and she was commissioned by the Anthropological Survey of India to make heads that belong to the Adivasis in India. So Millward's was did a set of sculptures, and these sculptures were purchased by B.S. Guha for the Anthropological Survey of India's galleries in 1938, way before independence. So they were purchased as anthropological objects. Today, when we see them in the museum, these objects, this particular head, is displayed in the gallery that is called the Evolution of Man. And you see Nihu Angami along with several other heads of different tribes of India displayed in a gallery right at the beginning, which tells you about the genetic diversity of India. Now, when I look at it, I find that the story of Nihu Angami is really lost. This is one object which actually has a name, because Millward knew Nihu Angami. This is the head of an Angami Naga, and his name is Nihu Angami. Now, these are almost, portraitures. And Nihu Angami is someone who writes in 1922 to the British government along with other Nagas, saying we do not want to join, India, because we are poor, we cannot support this large enterprise. Please, we do not want this. And this is a letter that I found with some research that was dated 1922. So here is a historical figure, and this historical figure now sits in the museum, where all you hear about him is that he represents the genetic diversity of India. So it is my favorite object, not because the museum has put it where it has put it. It is my favorite object because you are able to see a very complex story unfolding if you look at the history of this particular head. The museum obviously curated it in a certain way, and for me it was very important to tell the story that this is really the head of someone who was also a historical figure. So therefore I curated in the book, I curated the anthropological section, and then when I wanted to actually talk about this, I ended up interviewing Mark Elliott, who has done some work on the heads that Margaret Milward made, because she also gave a set of these heads to the museum in Cambridge, where he works. And Mark Elliott, of course, talks about how these objects don't have to be anthropological objects. They don't have to be artistic objects. It doesn't have to be an either or. They can be hybrid objects. Why can't it be both? Because it's made by an artist. She's moving towards portraiture, and it is also uh, an object that is, made by made for the Anthropological Survey of India. So I thought that was key to understanding that what had happened to the museum's curation, because they were acquired by the anthropology surveys galleries, they are put into the Human Evolution Gallery, and they talk about India's genetic diversity. But they also, what is forgotten in that curation is the fact that an artist had made those heads. And therefore, by putting this head right in the middle of the oral history interview I did with Mark Elliott, I think in our curation, we are trying to indicate that there's another possible way of looking at the same artifact.
I have both positive and negative experiences. For example, the positive experience it was a chance visit to the Van Gogh Museum in Amsterdam. Uh, I'm being from a science and technology background. I was not appreciating art as much I should have. So, but in a gallery which was being explained by a girl who was volunteering in the museum, she told us about a painting, about the artist, about the time of painting, about the brush, about the paint, and about the social system that influenced the painting. So much of information that a painting can convey is hardly written in museums. Therefore, it's the human interface or the communication technique that museum has employed to give it to its visitors. That makes it great. Therefore, I would say a museum is great not because of its artifacts, uh, not because of its collections. It is great because of its communication with its visitors. The way it engages the visitors, the way it communicates, the way it makes the visitor interact and learn from the museum is that's what matters. I'm sure the artifacts combined with good communication makes the museum great. I have a bad experience at Indian Museum, Kolkata, on about 10 years back when I was visiting it on a Sunday. And I particularly want to see those geological samples displayed by Geological Survey of India in their geology gallery. And that gallery has numerous collections of mineral samples, but very poorly communicating. They have only just written the name of the mineral, but doesn't tell much about its use, the origin, about the form, etc., etc. So I was looking for somebody to explain, and I found two guides sitting at one corner of the hall and putting their legs on the table and perhaps sleeping and directing the fan meant for visitor towards them. And so when I wanted to know something about, they were so passive that they didn't want to explain. That made my visit to the museum very discouraging and very, what do you call, boring. So I would say, unless a museum communicates well with its visitors, it's not to be going to be, or it's not going to be a great museum.
So again, I think I'd like to share one thing which is quite interesting again, because it has to do with the Indian Museum and the people who work at the museum, whose stories we don't hear. We hear stories of the object, but the stories of the people who work there is what we try to put into our book, where we curated the oral histories we did with people to talk about, what they actually did behind the scenes, what goes on behind the scenes at the museum. So what we did was, the Calcutta Museum, the Indian Museum, has an Egyptian gallery, which actually, even in my childhood, it was one of the most exciting things to see. And this is, something that, firstly, the hand of a female, which is still there displayed, was acquired from a pyramid near Cairo and sent to the Asiatic Society by C.W. Colton in 1844. And Colton at that time said it was more than 3,000 years old. Now, the mummy from Egypt actually was acquired in 1834 when Archbold had found this mummy, which somewhere near Gurna, and it took a very, very long time. It didn't come to this museum till 1883. I'll show you a picture. Now, this mummy is what is fascinating for most visitors to this museum. But what we discovered in the course of, getting material is that this particular gallery has a lot of Egyptian artifacts. Now, these artifacts are actually made in Calcutta by the artists who work there. And that, we thought, revealed another dimension of the museum. Because in most museums, there are artists who work on, how they would support the gallery to create that authentic look of, the pyramids, the desert, the Sphinx. So all of that, I interviewed several people, among them Makhunlal Banerjee, who is no more, who was a trained artist, and he joins the museum and he starts creating these. And he says, I would discuss and look at photographs and then start making the artifacts that would create the backdrops of some of these artifacts that are going to be displayed. So this is something that I thought, would be an interesting thing to put. So when we started doing oral histories and curated oral histories and objects for this book, we interviewed a number of artists who had worked at the museum, who had made not just replicas, but had done a lot of, artwork for the gallery, to support the gallery. And we also interviewed those who worked in restoration. We interviewed a darner, the young man who told us, right now I am repairing a coat. It belongs to the 18th century, and I know that when people come to see this, they are not coming to see the work I have done. They are trying to see the work that was done years and years ago by a great artisan who created this, who stitched this. All I'm doing is I'm putting in my best to repair it so people can see it. And that is a perspective that we don't often find when we look at the museums. We find that, those who are working behind the scenes, their stories are never told. And that is what we tried to do when we created this book.